Hello, friends. I am social ethicist, author, speaker, coach, conflict transformation specialist, Melody Stanford Martin. Welcome to the the introductory workshop for my book. If you're going to read my book, this is a great place to start. We're going to get the wheels turning about what the content is and great ways to approach it. So this is just getting the gears in motion. This is my book, Brave Talk: Building Resilient Relationships in the Face of Conflict. It was published in September 2020. It is a chock full toolkit of skills and tools and resources and silly stories and diagrams for getting better at conflict transformation. What is conflict transformation? Well, we're going to go into that in this lesson. So buckle up, hang tight, and let me share my screen. The magic words of online education. Here we go. So this will be about a 45 minutes or so presentation, and I urge you to use this in groups. Do this with someone. Don't do this alone. If you've got people to study with, people to read with, this book does really well in community, as a book club, as a discussion group of some kind, with your friends, with your family. I don't say that just to sell more books. I say that because we learn in community, we grow in community, and it's really helpful to have other people to bounce ideas off of. Here's me. I am Melody Stanford Martin, as you have already understood to be true. All right, let's start off with a little icebreaker. I want you to think of an example of the silliest argument that you have ever been in. The silliest. Pause and think about it for a sec, and then I'll give you an example of my silly argument. Okay, my silly argument. My partner, Corey, and I were making dinner, and it had been a very long and stressful day. We were trying to make a special dinner to enjoy these steaks that my sister had got us as a gift, like special gift steaks. So we're kind of at each other's throats, and we're making dinner, and by the time we sit down to eat, we're, tension levels are just up to here. We're not necessarily mad at each other, just stressed at the world, right? We sit down to eat, and I proceed to drop my entire plate onto the carpet. And at that point, I'm so overwhelmed that I started tearing up a little. we spent so much time on these steaks. We spent so much time planning the meal. And then all of a sudden, just, so Corey, my partner, who's also stressed, looked at me and said, "I'll take that steak. Just take my steak. Here, take the good one." And I said, "No, I'm not taking your steak." And he said, "Just take my steak. Take it." And I said, "No, take my steak. No, I'm not taking the freaking steak." We got this huge argument over who was trying to be the nicer person by eating the nasty steak, right? I apologize to any vegetarians or vegans in the crowd, but it just gives you an example of how conflict is all around us, right? That doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand. We all experience conflict all the time, right? Sometimes in really silly ways, sometimes in not so silly ways. You don't have to share this one if you're in a group of people, because sometimes this can bring up sad memories for people, but pause here and take a moment to silently reflect on the most painful argument or disagreement you've ever had with someone. Yeah. Yep. No, conflict is central to the human experience. It's part of our lives. And a lot of us will go to great lengths to avoid it or fight against it, instead of learning to deal with it in healthy ways. That is where my work comes in. Let's identify the pain points, okay? What are types of conflicts you are finding or you have found in your life? Pause and take a moment to talk about this. This is what I hear most often: politics and religion at the top of the heap, which is the reason I actually started on the journey of writing the book, because I have very strong differences of belief and opinion with people I love dearly over politics and religion, and it's caused me a lot of pain. So if that's you, I feel you. Boundaries and rules, semantics and facts. Semantics meaning what is the meaning of the word that we use, the words that we use. Facts versus alternative facts. Who gets to decide what facts are in a post-fact world, supposedly? And resources themselves, money, for example. What are some feelings or words that come to mind when you think about these conflicts? pause and think about this or discuss. This is what I hear most often: frustration, grief, anger, disappointment, awkwardness, disillusionment, or breakdown, either personal breakdown from a mental health perspective, an inability to continue to function, or a breakdown of relationships. I want to take a moment to reflect on the impact this has on us on a somatic or a body level, right? When we are in conflict, especially conflict that we're having trouble resolving or getting through, especially points of impasse where conflict resolution might not really be possible, we might experience sleep interruptions, difficulties concentrating or decision making, digestive upset, muscle aches, headaches, sense of impending doom, fatigue, irritability, irrational behavior. Over a long period of time, the cumulative effect of this can lead to toxic stress, which is a medical term. It's a medical and a psychological term that refers to a constant state of what could become traumatizing conditions, right? And it has an impact on our body. It makes us sick to be in conflict with each other, right? Especially when we don't deal with that conflict in healthy ways and that conflict explodes or implodes internally, or if that conflict is unresolvable. I want to dive into this because this is a really, I won't say fun, might not be a fun exercise for you, but it's an enlightening exercise for a lot of us. Each of us have a personal style of engaging conflict. I actually just wrote an article about this for Psychology Today called "What's Your Conflict Style?" We all have a style of conflict, sometimes more than one. And we might use these in different situations, but a lot of us has never given a lot of critical thought to our conflict style. So let me ask you, what is your conflict style? Okay, here are 6 that I have identified. You might think of more. Avoidance will tend to want to run for the hills. Avoidants tend to see any conflict, any loud noises, any discord, any disagreement as is very scary. They will want to get out as quickly as possible. And it often leads to that conflict bubbling up under the surface for a long period of time and causing damage over time because it's not dealt with. Brawlers like to put their dukes up. Okay, they might walk into a situation and just start swinging. And a lot of times brawlers don't give consideration to the consequences of their words or actions, and they have a hard time distinguishing what's fighting fair or what's fighting below the belt. And they can do a lot of damage to themselves and to others. Conciliators. Now, some people hear this and say, well, shouldn't we be conciliatory? Well, being conciliatory is sort of pandering or kowtowing, right? It's kind of walking on eggshells and trying to placate a threat. So conciliators tend to rush to resolve the conflict no matter what the long-term consequences are. They might really opt for band-aid approaches, and they might opt to hurt themselves or take on unnecessary burden or not consider their own needs so that the conflict will go away. So on the surface, it might sound like these folks are doing the right thing, and certainly they mean well. All of these conflict styles, you could mean very well, but the cumulative effect of them is not always a healthy outcome. Debaters, okay? Debaters like to intellectualize. They see a conflict between people, and instead of being vulnerable and tapping into their emotions and sharing from their personal experience, and I am guilty of this a lot, we intellectualize, we separate ourselves from, and we just talk about this kind of obscure world of theories and ideas, right? There's 2 problems with this. First of all, it doesn't facilitate real human connection. It focuses on winning a lot of times. It focuses on being the smartest person in the room instead of actually opening up and sharing and connecting, right? The second thing is that some of us get more debate training than others. Some of us, our education, we had a debate class, or we were on a debate team, or our personality is more conducive to debate. Others of us might be just as smart, but we're not good at debating in the moment. So we panic and freeze, right? So debating, it creates power imbalances in the room, and it can be counterproductive to actually repairing relationships and forming healthy human bonds. We're repairing bonds. Devil's advocates. Devil's advocates are, most of us have met one, if not we are one. Devil's advocates value disagreement for disagreement's sake. In a healthy sense, a healthy devil's advocate will use this as a tool of empathy. It sounds strange, but stay with me. Saying, hey, what about this perspective? We didn't consider how it might impact this person. What about this idea, right? How about we talk about this for a while, even though no one wants to talk about it, let's bring it up because we need to talk about it, right? That's a healthy devil's advocate. What if we do the opposite of the thing that we're proposing? What happens then, right? Exploring options, exploring ideas, trying to make sure everyone's viewpoint is taken into consideration. An unhealthy devil's advocate also lacks vulnerability, right? They can use that as a shield. And unhealthy devil's advocates, sometimes they just like to be contrary no matter what, and they'll never come to a place of agreement or consensus because they just want to be contrary. And that can be extremely frustrating and damaging for the people around them. The last style that I've identified is cooperatives, and this is a rare style, and usually it takes some skills to learn this style because we're not culturally, most of us, taught this, okay? Cooperatives understand that disagreement is a part of life. Conflict is a part of life, and it's really uncomfortable to work through disagreement, but cooperatives take their time and they make sure they're getting to the root of the problem, right? They are the true conflict transformers of us, right? They don't settle for cheap peace, they don't settle for band-aid fixes, but they really try to collaborate with all parties. And even if they can't reach agreement, work together to move forward and create a plan of action. Okay, that's not common. That has to be learned in many cases. Okay. Where do these styles of conflict come from? Where do they come from? How do we all have a style of conflict and maybe don't even know it? Let me argue that they are largely learned, except for your personality or maybe your body chemistry, the chemicals in your brain, for example. Almost all of this is learned behavior from family systems, the role you play in your family, from your past experiences with conflict, from your social location, where you are in the world, race, class, gender, ability, yada, yada, right? And the cultural influences that arise from being born in the world into that certain place in society. Your education, what you have been taught directly, what your teachers told you, hey, this is how you resolve conflict. This is how you don't resolve conflict. Direct messages about education, right? Indirectly, our community modeling. And this sometimes can be even more powerful than direct education. Who's around us? What did our parents do? What did our role models do? What did people in our community do to resolve conflict? How did they approach conflict? Because that's going to inform our approach. Our media consumption, right? What we absorb, what we intake into our minds, into our eyeballs. And then finally, importantly, the stakes of an issue. If there's an issue that doesn't impact me personally very strongly, I might not really care about it that much. And I might have a different approach to that conflict than if an issue does impact my life really directly and really personally. And when I say that these conflict styles are learned, what I mean is that you could actually develop a very opposite style of conflict from the one you were born with, or for example, sorry, not the one you were born with, an opposite style of conflict than the one you were raised with and socialized with. For example, if your family just screamed at each other all the time growing up, right, you might develop an avoidant style because screaming is very stressful for you and you hated it as a kid. So now as an adult, you cannot have anyone in your house raise their voice or you will panic. Okay. So when I say learned, I mean that these styles are influenced by our social environment and they are socialized. We are socialized with these styles, right? The good news in this is that if conflict styles are learned, then to some degree, they can be unlearned or we'll say relearned, right? So if you have a conflict style that you feel is not so healthy, you can learn a different style. It's possible. I grew up as a classic avoider and sometimes debater, but mostly avoider. I grew up with actually adult role models in my life telling me in situations where I was in leadership and I was supposed to deal with a conflict that arose, telling me, oh, just do nothing and it'll go away. So that's what I was taught. I was taught that over and over and over again. And as an adult, even as a conflict transformation specialist, I've had to relearn a lot of these things, and that's okay. It's very, very normal for a lot of us, okay? So let me ask you this question. Out of these styles, what is best for community? Okay, we're not trying to shame any person for being one way. These styles are, all of us grow up in certain ways that we have a tendency to one or more of these styles. You can certainly have more than one style depending on the situation, but we need to ask ourselves when we're approaching situations of conflict, what's best for community? What's best for the relationship? What's best for the long-term sustainability of health for both me and the person involved, right? And that asking those questions will cause us to approach it a lot of times in a different way than we might have our knee-jerk default response. Before we move forward into conflict transformation, and the book goes more into detail about conflict styles too, so you'll get to revisit this, excuse me, when you read. I want to talk for a bit about polarization. So polarization, a lot of us feel, and I talk about this in chapter 1 of the book, a lot of us feel like we are existing in a pressure cooker within these concentric circles of conflict, I call them, because the conflict that exists on a global level influences the national level. The conflict that exists on the national level influences our local community level. And that local level influences our family and friends. So by the time you drill down to these interpersonal relationships, we have things pushing at us on all sides, right? And if you read the news, that knowledge of all of those conflicts is going to impact your stress level. So by the time you get to an interpersonal relationship, you're already influenced by all of these things, right? And you could argue that the state of our global conflict is made up of all these individual conflicts, right? The global is made up of the individual as much as the individual is impacted by the global, right? We are interconnected. We are interconnected. Now, let me ask you, what happens when over the course of 20, 25 years, we, and I'm speaking from a United States context, we are becoming more polarized. We have an increase in conflict. We have an exponential growth in conflict because we are growing farther and farther apart ideologically. You'll see in 1994 here, Democrats and Republicans were pretty kind of similar, right? There's a big overlap, there's a big purple space. As you get to 2004 and then even to 2017, those start migrating to the extremes, right? So you need to understand that a lot of times we experience these conflicts, this polarization in our interpersonal relationships, and it's hard not to take it personally, but we are all caught within these larger social systems that cause us to push apart from each other. I want to ask you to pause here and take a moment to reflect on how polarization has shown up in your life recently. Now, why does polarization happen? Polarization happens when people are ideologically pushed apart to extremes, right? And it's important to remember that sometimes this is manufactured for monetary or political gain. And there's a lot I could say about that, but you need to understand that we are caught up in these bigger systems that are sometimes intentionally manipulated in order to get something from us, right? Polarization can be rooted in any combination of, and this is manufactured or not manufactured, fear and demonization, which are failures of empathy. Polarization can come from media bubbles, right? Or algorithms, if you're on social media, where we are presented with and only surrounded by people who have a similar construction of reality that we have, that see things from a similar perspective than we do, right? And we look at people in different media bubbles and we go, how are you nuts? How can you possibly think or believe that way? Because we're only surrounded by people who agree with us. And actually, back to this point really quickly, there's a recent statistic that 40% of people who voted in the 2020 election didn't know a single person voting for the other candidate. For example, 40% of Trump voters did not know a single person voting for Biden, and 40% of Biden voters did not know a single person voting for Trump. So not only are we polarized, but we're siphoned, we're separated, right? And that has been, I understand, and again, it's gonna be a whole nother conversation, that has been on the part of some of these social media giants to reduce the amount of conflict because people were getting to fights. Because when people are exposed to different viewpoints and they don't agree, they'll fight more, right? But if we siphon people off and keep them in their different buckets, then we have less conflict and people are more prone to use our social media platform because it's a more pleasant experience, right? Polarization can be rooted in disinformation. The United States has been under cyber warfare, cyber attack for many years from foreign entities. Again, a lot could be said about that, but this leads to misunderstanding and confusion, right? Polarization can be rooted in power imbalances and injustice, which are systems of oppression. meaning that if one group is more powerful than another, has more social power and does not want to share that power, that of course leads to polarization. It pushes the other side away because they're like, well, you don't want to help us, you don't want to cooperate with us, we're going to go over here and form our own channels, our own power, because we can't participate in your systems. Polarization can also be simply rooted in different versions, different visions of the way the world ought to be. And in my experience, this is where a lot of religious differences, religious conflict is based, because my religious concept of how the world should be, what sin is, or maybe you don't have a concept of sin, right? What God is, or maybe you don't have a concept of God, what God's will is, or maybe you don't have a concept of God's will because you don't believe in God, right? And how you interpret sacred texts, that all informs how you think the way the world should be, the way the world ought to be. So if you think of polarization as two magnets that are facing away, as in they are repelling each other, right? That's really the cumulative effect of polarization. We are pushing away from each other. So the questions where we need to be asking in this are why have we turned away from each other to begin with? Why have we turned away from each other? And what are the forces that are repelling us? And let's add a third question here. Do we want to stop being polarized? A lot of us don't want that because we feel that that leads to cheap reconciliation without accountability. You can't be buddy with someone who has ill intent toward you or is not safe, right? So to reestablish safety in that relational strength is the goal before we talk about ending polarization and understanding why we've turned away from each other and what forces are repelling us. For example, how much of this has been manufactured? Who is this benefiting? Because it's not benefiting us. These are all important questions to ask. So the question is, how do we eventually overcome polarization and practice healthier conflict? I'm going to offer that the answer to this question is conflict transformation. This is a lens and this is an approach. And I want to go into more of what that means because I am so passionate about this idea. What is conflict transformation? Okay, you might have had classes on conflict resolution, figure out the conflict, say you're sorry, put a Band-Aid on it, move right along, right? Conflict transformation is a pretty different approach. It says, let's take our time, let's get to the root of the problem and address it fully so we can prevent it from happening again. And that means a lot of times we're digging into bigger systems and the way things work, the way societies work, the way relationships work, our culture, our patterns, our institutions, our policies, our laws. It's way broader. It's systems thinking. Conflict transformation is a legacy, right? It's a legacy of justice. It's rooted in the work of Gandhi and Dr. King and Gustavo Gutierrez and Nelson Mandela. The word itself comes from a professor at Notre Dame named John Paul Lederach, who is a Mennonite pacifist. But it's not just a religious movement, right? It's also been heavily informed by indigenous peacemaking traditions around the world. So when we're talking about a legacy of justice, we're talking about, even in the last 100 years, so many movements saying, how can we break cycles of violence? How can we prevent further harm instead of just fixing something in the moment? Okay. So you can see side by side, it's a really different attitude. It's a different posturing. Conflict transformation, right, is in the yellow. So let's just compare really quick. Conflict resolution tends to say conflict is bad, let's get rid of it. Conflict transformation says conflict provides important opportunities to learn and grow. Conflict resolution says the other side is my enemy or my opponent. Conflict transformation says the other side is my conversation partner and fellow human, right? If I see them as an opponent, I'm going to see them as a collaborative opponent. Conflict resolution says we should agree and get along. Conflict transformation says, sometimes it's not possible to agree, but we should collaborate and create healthier ways of interacting. Conflict resolution says the highest priority is finding a solution so we can solve the problem. Conflict transformation says the highest priority is understanding each other and building stronger relationships so we can generate trust. Conflict transformation says we should end conflict. We should end it. Conflict transformation says we should identify and disarm the destructive underlying causes of conflict so we can build something better. Conflict resolution says conflict makes me uncomfortable and anxious, and these bad feelings now. Conflict transformation says, yeah, I'm uncomfortable and anxious. That's true, but I'm not going to let those feelings rule me, because in the long term, working through those feelings is worth it for the sake of the relationship, right? For the sake of transforming the root causes of conflict. And finally, conflict resolution says success means moving on despite long-term consequences, because we're going to fix it, we're going to get back to normal, and we're just going to be nice to each other. Conflict transformation says success means seeing with new eyes and creating a positive, collaborative plan of action so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. All of this framework comes out of a school of thought, a field of thought called restorative justice. Restorative justice is different from what's commonly practiced in our country, known as punitive justice. Punitive justice is focusing on punishing people, dominating and controlling people, forcing people to bend to our will, even if we have to be violent. Punitive justice focuses on human pessimism, like people will always let you down, right? We have to force people to be good and punish people to be good, right? And it says we will reject or commit social death if we have to, because we can't tolerate differences of opinion. Restorative justice says our intent is to restore the offending party to right relationship with boundaries when necessary. It's focused on community building. It has a deep human optimism, meaning we believe humans want to live in peace and harmony. We believe humans want to be kind and good. The vast majority of us, right? So the ultimate goal is social wholeness and resilience, okay? Instead of punishing, we're going to try to restore. We're going to try to restore. It's a huge mental shift. Let me pause and ask you this. Over the course of your life, what have you been taught more? Punitive justice or restorative justice? Take a moment and think about this or talk about this. All right, next we're going to get into a section about healthy versus unhealthy disagreement, okay? Healthy disagreement means, I want you to put an equal sign in your head. Healthy disagreement means building resilient relationships, okay? We want to go from a place of walking on eggshells. We've all had that situation where we feel like we can't disagree. We can't say anything negative, right? We're walking on eggshells. We're afraid. We're fragile. Move from a place of eggshells to a place where we're stretchy like rubber bands, right? We can stretch for each other. We can be uncomfortable for each other. We can work through hard disagreement, and we can snap back together. It's not going to break us. Unhealthy disagreement has this underlying understanding of cruelty, domination. It threatens human rights and dignity, and it's violent and punitive, right? So if your ideas are cruel and dominating and threatening human rights, but you're nice about it when you communicate it, that's not healthy, right? If your ideas are wonderful, but in your methods of communication, you're cruel and dominating and you're not respecting human rights and dignity, that's also unhealthy disagreement, okay? I work in a lot of spaces with a lot of activists, and as much as I love my activists, my fellow activists, sometimes I see people with great ideas, but they're being absolutely cruel in the ways they're communicating those things. And I would say, as a conflict transformation specialist, that's not healthy disagreement, okay? Healthy disagreement needs, in its ideas and its methods, to practice tolerance and patience, to educate, right? To share power, to protect human rights and dignity, and to focus on restorative justice, to focus on restorative justice, right? All to say, that doesn't mean we tolerate violent hatred and bigotry, right? There's absolutely space within healthy disagreement to stand up and use very strong words to say, no, we will not accept hatred. We will not accept violence. We will not accept cruelty, right? You can have strong opinions. You can be articulate and powerful and forceful in your healthy disagreement. I'm not telling you to be nice. I'm telling you to really think about the methods that you're using to communicate. And why is that? For a moment, let's pause and think about this. Why is that? Because most of us, the vast majority of us, do not change our minds when we're screamed at. That is not a situation, a method of communication that leads to transformation in most cases, right? Think back to a time when you changed your mind. Did it involve someone screaming at you? Probably not, because when we are under states of stress, for example, when someone's yelling at us, our bodies are surging with stress hormones that physically and neurologically and chemically impede our ability to learn and engage new information. So when you're communicating and when you're doing activist work, right? Think about the conditions you're creating for people to either learn and be restored to right relationship, giving a path of education, or are you punishing and being cruel? So let me offer this. We need disagreement to be healthy. Our society would not be strong without healthy disagreement. The lifeblood of a free democratic society is the art of healthy disagreement, okay? Disagreement makes our ideas stronger. It makes our relationships stronger. It makes our community stronger, and it makes our democracy stronger. I want you to think about a time when someone has been a worthy opponent to you, okay? A worthy opponent, someone who sharpens you, someone who chooses to show you dignity even if you don't agree, has a goal of mutual edification, has a goal of education, right? They fight fair, they fight credibly, and they give credit where it's due, okay? You might never agree, but if you're dealing with a worthy opponent, that can be a game changer. And if you take the time to be a worthy opponent to someone, that can be a game changer. Versus an unworthy opponent, right? An unworthy opponent seeks to dominate or control. An unworthy opponent uses personal attacks. An unworthy opponent misrepresents their opponent's argument. An unworthy opponent perpetuates misinformation, and an unworthy opponent jumps to conclusions, to name a few, okay? When you are a worthy opponent to someone, when you disagree with someone in healthy ways, when you take the time, you're giving that person a gift. I want you to think about when is the time you have been a worthy opponent to someone, and when has someone been a worthy opponent to you? Take some time and think through that question. Finally, I want to ask you, what are your growing edges? What are your growing edges? There's a beautiful civil rights activist and theologian named Howard Thurman who wrote, "The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against a time when there shall be new leaves, fresh blossoms, and green fruit. Such is the growing edge." Okay, so the growing edge are the roots that's spreading out under the surface. We can't see the fruit of it yet, but we know there's something growing down there. Okay, in everything we've talked about so far, take a moment and talk about or think about, what are your growing edges in everything we've discussed? What out of this would you like to grow in? What areas would you like to grow in? What questions do you have that are yet unanswered, right? Where do you want to go with this? How do you want to grow? What skills do you want to gain in all of this? Take a moment and discuss. All right, quickly, we're going to dive into Brave Talk. So if you're going to read the book, here it is. I am completely biased, but I think this book is extremely helpful for a lot of us. It's helpful for me writing it. And I've gotten amazing reviews from people who are family members, who are friends, who are clergy workers, who are social workers, saying that the content in this is really needed and there aren't a lot of resources out there yet like this. So I'm really excited that you are interested in reading it. So there are 3 parts to this book: understanding impasse, engaging impasse, and transforming impasse. Why impasse, Melody? Well, because my experience, which in the introduction, you'll learn my story. My experience was such that impasse created the hardest conflicts for me to navigate. It's easy to navigate conflict where there's a solution, where there's an agreement, where there's just a little misunderstanding, you can clear it up and then everyone goes back to, giving each other high fives. It's not so easy when you fundamentally disagree with someone and you're probably never going to change each other's mind. That's what I've been ruminating on for many years, and that's the basis of this work. That is also the story of many of us in the United States as we're experiencing a time of deep polarization. Part 1 of the book introduces impasse, right? What is it? I tell my story. I talk about 3 secrets of impasse, navigating the hardest conflicts. I talk about fear and the role fear plays in conflict, right? Fear, I argue, is the root of all conflict. How do we understand that? What do we do about it? And chapter 3, conflict and power, why it's so important to understand systems of power and how they work, because how many conflicts arise from power imbalances, from injustice? We have to understand how this works, both in big and small ways. Chapter 4, well, part 2 is engaging impasse. So chapter 4 dives into why we need disagreement, why disagreement is a gift. My partner's making dinner. Why we need disagreement and why disagreement is a gift, right? If you're not convinced yet, maybe that chapter will convince you. Chapter 5, a guide to asking great questions, the art of question asking. And chapter 6, dealing with all of those awful, uncomfortable feelings that arise in situations of conflict. I've had so many people tell me that their favorite chapter is chapter 6 because it offers a really helpful framework around the idea of 2 rivers of feelings. I call them 2 rivers of feelings. That has been extraordinarily helpful for many readers. And part 3, transforming impasse. Once we understand impasse, once we can start engaging it, right, and changing our relationship with it, we can start to transform it. How do we transform it? Chapter 7 is all about assumptions and our structures of meaning, right? How we understand and believe what we believe, what happens when our structures of meaning come into conflict with someone else's structure of meaning, right? And how to challenge the assumptions and craft the way that we interact with people who disagree with us. Chapter 8, building a better house. It's about ethical persuasion, how to form what I call well-balanced arguments. And actually, I take classical rhetorical strategies like logos, ethos, and pathos, and I rename them to head, cred, and thread. And I talk about how in modern language, how to craft arguments that are solid, that are credible, that are ethical, that are reasonable, that are generous, and that use emotion in appropriate ways. And finally, chapter 9, how do we build resilient relationships, which is the subtitle of this book. I left it to chapter 9 because chapter 9 is this great summary of all the other chapters. If you only have time to read one chapter, chapter 9 is your friend. That'll be just an overview of some of the biggest ideas in the book, and it really challenges us to think, what is a resilient relationship and how do we build it? How do we show up for each other? How do we see each other even if we can never agree? How do we build relationships that can stand the test of time, relationships that can hold the weight of conflict and not break? Okay. So I want to thank you so much for reading this. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really grateful to all of my readers. I would love to hear your feedback. You can email me at Melody, M-E-L-O-D-Y, at bravetalkproject.com. I'd love to hear from you. Also, there is a currently free at the time of recording this video, conversation game called Basecamp that I have created. And this game is designed to give you a structure and a sandbox for practicing difficult conversations, because a lot of times we're just thrown into the ring without any tools. We never learn how to actually do it. So this game is really great from, like, I would say middle school on, 12 years old, around 12 years old, maybe a little younger if the kids are mature, all the way up to adults will get something out of this game and practicing the skills that this game teaches. So check out Basecamp in addition to Brave Talk. Thank you so, so much. And I really just appreciate you. That's what I want to say. I appreciate you. And I look forward to your insights. And I hope you enjoy reading Brave Talk. Have a great day.